Hey there everyone, Ramesh here, back again with another video. In this video, let's take a look at the roadmap to learn Spring Boot and microservices. Well, this roadmap is for beginners who want to learn how to build RESTful web services and microservices using Spring Boot. Well, this roadmap is my personal opinion, guys, as per my experience on Spring Boot and microservices, but there could be, other opinions by different developers. Well, I assume that you have a knowledge on Java, servlet and filters. Okay. Well, basically Java, servlet and filters is, prerequisite to learn Spring Boot. I am mentioning servlet and filters because Spring MUC is built using servlets and Spring Security is built using filters. Okay. If you have knowledge on at least basic knowledge on servlet and filters, then it will help you to understand Spring MUC and Spring Security. Alright, Spring Boot is a very popular Java framework for building RESTful web services and microservices. Well, nowadays microservices is the hot buzzword in the software development, and many organizations nowadays prefer building enterprise applications using microservices architecture. In Java community, Spring Boot and Spring Cloud is a great combination to build microservices. Okay, so in this roadmap I am going to first explain you how you can learn the Spring Boot, and then later on we'll see how you can learn the microservices. Well, before learning Spring Boot, you can learn Spring Core fundamentals or basics first. Alright. Well, I have seen many times that people, especially beginners, directly jump into learning Spring Boot without having a prior knowledge of Spring Core basics. Well, if you learn Spring Boot without Spring Core, then it seems magic for you. Okay, initially if you don't know Spring Core and if you learn Spring Boot, then it seems like a magic for you because Spring Boot is doing a lot of things behind the scene, right? And when it comes for the customization, then you will feel complex because you don't know the Spring Core basics, right? Well, basically Spring Boot behind the scene uses all the Spring Core, basics, fundamentals and all those stuff. Alright, so Spring Boot is basically developed on top of Spring framework, and Spring Boot internally uses all the Spring Core basics and all Spring related libraries and all those stuff, right? In order to understand how Spring Boot works behind the scene and how Spring Boot auto configuration work behind the scene, you have to learn Spring Core fundamentals first. That's the reason I always suggest you guys, before learning Spring Boot, at least have a basic knowledge of Spring Core fundamentals like dependency injection, Spring IOC, Spring AOP, Spring Bean scopes, and how to configure Spring Beans using different configurations like Java based configuration and annotation based configuration, and learn important Spring annotations. Okay, just take a look into these few Spring Core fundamentals so that it will be easy for you to understand Spring Boot easily and what Spring Boot does behind the scene. Alright, once you learn Spring Core, then you can go ahead and learn Spring Boot. Well, when you learn the Spring Boot, make sure that you check out these Spring Boot key features first. Okay, so these are the very important Spring Boot key features I have mentioned over here. For example, Spring Boot starter dependencies. Well, Spring Boot provides a lot of starter dependencies that we can use to quickly configure our Spring Boot application, and we don't have to search for compatible versions of the libraries. Spring Boot will manage all the compatible versions, and it will basically provide a bunch of dependencies. Okay, and auto configuration. Well, Spring Boot will automatically configure beans whenever it finds dependencies in a class path. We don't have to manually configure the required beans. Okay, Spring Boot will does for us. So this is auto configuration is basically very popular feature of Spring Boot. And next is elegant configuration management. Well, Spring Boot provides features to configure a lot of things externally. For example, if you want to deploy your Spring Boot application in different environments, then you can simply change the configuration externally. You don't have to go into Spring Boot application and change the things as per the environment. That is awesome, right? We can deploy a single application in different environments. Just we need to change the externalized configuration. Okay. Well, next is Spring Boot Actuator. Well, Spring Boot Actuator is very useful. It provides a production ready features. For example, you can monitor the application status, you can monitor the health metrics and all those stuff. Okay, so Spring Boot basically provides a lot of REST API endpoints to monitor the application health check, metrics, application status, and bin details. Okay, application context, bin details, and a lot of stuff. All right. Next is embedded server support. Well, Spring Boot automatically provide embedded servers to deploy Spring Boot application as a standalone or a jar file. We don't have to make a Spring Boot application as a WAR file and deploy an external server. Okay, Spring Boot basically provide embedded server support, and by default it will use embedded Tomcat server. Okay, and it will basically support different servers like Tomcat, Jetty, and Restful. Okay, as of now, Spring Boot supports these three embedded servers. Well, once you learn Spring Boot key features, then you can go ahead and build REST APIs using Spring Boot. Okay, you can go ahead and build get REST API post, put, and delete. Next, you need to learn how to build the repository layer or the DAO layer. Well, basically Spring provides different modules to develop the repository layer. For example, Spring Data JPA, Spring Data MongoDB, Spring Data JDBC. Well, if you want to use the relational databases like MySQL, Oracle, or PostgreSQL database, then you can go ahead and use Spring Data JPA in your Spring Boot application to communicate with relational databases. And Spring Data JPA internally uses Hibernate as a JPA provider. Okay, and Spring Data MongoDB. Well, if you want to use MongoDB as a NoSQL database in your Spring Boot application, then go ahead and use Spring Data MongoDB, module, and Spring Data JDBC. Well, if you want to use a JDBC in a DAO layer or the repository layer, then you can go ahead and use Spring Data JDBC. Well, in this roadmap, I have mentioned Spring Data and Spring Data, modules, because Spring Data is getting more popular nowadays because it significantly reduces a lot of boilerplate code that is required to implement the DAO layer or the repository layer for various persistent stores. Okay, and these are the portfolio projects. So these are the very popular portfolio project that we can use as per the database. For relational databases, you can use Spring Data JPA. For NoSQL database like MongoDB, you can use Spring Data MongoDB, and you can use Spring Data JDBC. If you want to use JDBC in your project, then you can go ahead and use Spring Data JDBC. It will reduce a lot of boilerplate code. Okay, next, Spring MUC web application. Well, I'm going to suggest you to use Spring Boot to develop RESTful web services, also web MUC applications. All right, let's say if you want to develop Spring MUC web applications, then I'm going to suggest you to first learn Spring MUC concepts. For example, dispatcher servlet. Okay, and how dispatcher servlet process the request. Okay, it will consult to the handler mapper. Okay, and then learn what is controller, learn what is handler method, learn what is view handler. Okay, go ahead and learn all the Spring MUC fundamentals. To develop the view layer, I'm going to suggest you to use Thymeleaf template engine. Okay, you can also use JSP, but JSP is something outdated, and nowadays developers use Thymeleaf to develop the view layer in the Spring MUC web application. All right. Well, once you learn how to build REST APIs using Spring Boot and how to build Spring MUC web applications using Spring Boot, next you need to secure REST APIs and web applications, right? For that, you can learn Spring Security. Well, basically Spring Security is a framework that provides authentication, authorization, and protection against common attacks. And basically Spring Security is a de facto standard for securing web applications and RESTful APIs in Java. Alright, so I am going to suggest you to learn Spring Security because it provides out-of-the-box implementation for authentication and authorization. And nowadays JWT token-based authentication is very popular. Okay, you can learn what is JWT and how you can use JWT with Spring Security. Okay, so JWT is getting more popular nowadays, and you can go ahead and learn how to use JWT along with Spring Security to provide a token-based authentication. Alright, well, next, testing. Well, testing is a very important part of software development. So as a developer, whatever the code we have write, we have to make sure that whatever the code we have written is working as expected, right? For that we have to do testing. In testing you can do the unit testing as well as integration testing. And Spring Boot supports, Spring Boot provides a lot of features to do unit testing and integration testing of your Spring Boot application. For instance, Spring Boot provides Spring Boot test annotation, which we can use to do integration testing. And Spring also provides mock MUC class, which we can use to perform REST API calls. And Spring Boot provides data JPA test annotation to test the persistence layer components. And Spring Boot again provides mock MUC annotation, which we can use to mock the dependencies and we can add in a application context. Alright, so these are the important annotations and classes that we can use to test Spring Boot application. So make sure that you learn how to do unit testing and integration testing in your Spring Boot application. Okay, so this is a very important phase of your Spring Boot application development. And next, databases. Well, as a Java developer, you should have a good knowledge of databases. So here I have mentioned few of the commonly used relational databases and NoSQL databases. So relational databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, or MS SQL, okay, and NoSQL, MongoDB, Cassandra, and there are a lot of other NoSQL databases out there. I have just mentioned here common ones. As a Java programmer, you should know the basic understanding of these RDBMS as well as NoSQL databases. Alright, so in order to learn Spring Boot, you can follow this learning path or the roadmap. First learn Spring Core and then Spring Boot features, and then learn how to build the REST APIs using Spring Boot and develop the DAO layer or the repository layer using one of the module, and develop the web application using Spring Boot and use Thymeleaf as a view layer. And in order to secure your REST APIs and web applications, you can go ahead and learn Spring Security. And to secure the REST APIs using token-based authentication, you can use JWT. And in order to perform unit testing and integration testing of your Spring Boot application, then go ahead and check out all these annotations. And yeah, so as a Java programmer, you should have a basic understanding of databases as well. Well, once you learn Spring Boot, then you can go ahead and learn microservices. Okay, so in Java, basically Spring Boot and Spring Cloud is a great combination to develop the microservices. Alright, so microservices is basically an architectural style that structures an application as a collection of services. Okay, and these collection of services can be highly maintainable and testable, and these services are loosely coupled, independently deployable, and they are basically organized around business capabilities, and each and every service can be owned by a small team. Well, in order to learn microservices, you should have to learn Spring Boot first. And I'm going to suggest you don't directly learn the microservices using Spring Boot. Just try to develop few monolithic applications. Monolithic applications meaning web applications or Restful APIs. Okay, and then you will get some idea like how you can break your monolithic application into small services as a microservices. Alright, so microservices is not a simple topic. It is basically a complex topic, and you need to learn a lot of stuff in order to develop a complete microservices enterprise application. So before learning the microservices, you should have to learn Spring Boot, and we already gone through the roadmap to learn Spring Boot, right? So along with Spring Boot, you should have to learn Spring Cloud. Alright, now what we're going to do is we're going to see what are the Spring Cloud modules that you need to take a look into, and message queues, and then how you can deploy microservices in a cloud. Well, you might be wondering what is Spring Cloud. Well, let me explain with a diagram. So you can see here, this is the simple microservice architecture. Okay, and you can see in this microservice architecture there are different services, and Spring Boot apps, Spring Boot apps, Spring Boot apps. So these are the three, let's say these are the three services in our Spring microservices architecture. Alright, and apart from these services, you can see other services: config server, services history, circuit breaker, Spring Cloud, Seth, API gateway. So these are the different services, right? And these are basically a common patterns or the tools that we need in our microservices, because let's say if you want to manage all the configurations of all the services in a central place, then you can go ahead and use config server. Okay, so we need a basically a different common patterns in order to manage all the services that we develop in a microservice architecture. So basically Spring Cloud provides all these services, okay, all these common patterns, okay, and we no need to search for other third-party services. Spring Cloud provides a lot of common patterns or a lot of tools that we can simply use to build a complete microservice enterprise application. For instance, if you can head over to the Spring Cloud official documentation over here, you can see Spring Cloud provides all these portfolio projects, and we can use these portfolio projects as per our need. Okay, for example, if you want to use a circuit breaker service, then Spring Cloud basically provides abstraction layer for this circuit breaker, and it provides the option to choose the implementations. You can see these are the different implementations. And if you want to have a API gateway, then Spring Cloud provides abstraction layer for API gateway. Okay, and if you want to use service registry, then you can go ahead and check out Spring Cloud console. Okay, so basically Spring Cloud provides all these common patterns in a distributed systems. For example, configuration management, service registry, circuit breakers, okay, and control bus and all this stuff. Well, here I have mentioned a few Spring Cloud modules. So basically these are the few commonly used Spring Cloud modules in the microservices. Well, for example, Spring Cloud config server. Well, to externalize configuration of the applications in a central config server with the ability to update the configuration values without requiring to restart the applications, we can use Spring Cloud config server with Git or console or Zookeeper as a config repository. Well, it's very important to manage all the configurations of all the services in a central place, right? And if we manage all these configuration in a central place, then we don't have to restart all the services. We can simply manage in a central config server using Git or console or Zookeeper as a config repository. Next, Netflix Eureka based service registry. Well, as there could be many services in our microservice architecture, and we need to scale up or scale down dynamically. We need basically, in order to do this, we need a service registry. Okay, and yeah, so in order to have this functionality, we can use Netflix Eureka based service registry. Well, next is Netflix Hystrix as a circuit breaker. Well, in microservice based architecture, one service might depend on another service, and if one service goes down, then failures may cascade to other services as well, right? So in order to avoid this, Spring Cloud provides Netflix Hystrix based circuit breaker to handle these kind of issues. Well, next is Spring Cloud security. Well, in microservices architecture, most of the microservices need to be accessible to authenticated users only, right? And most of the time we use single sign-on feature, right? And basically Spring Cloud security provides authentication service using OAuth 2. Okay, so in order to implement OAuth 2 authentication functionality, you can use Spring Cloud security. All right, so next is Spring Cloud Slate with Zipkin. So this Spring Cloud module you can use for distributed tracing. For instance, you can use this module to see where trace data reported to, how many traces to keep, and if remote fields are sent or not, which libraries are traced. Okay, so in order to maintain all these information, you can use Spring Cloud Slate. All right, next is Spring Cloud Contract. All right, so these are the few Spring Cloud modules. Apart from these Spring Cloud modules, you can go ahead and check out all the Spring Cloud modules over here in official documentation of Spring framework, Spring.io project/Spring Cloud. So this is the page which contains all the Spring Cloud modules. Okay, so basically Spring Cloud provides all these tools for the developers to quickly build some of the common patterns in the distributed systems. For example, few more important Spring Cloud portfolio projects. Like if you want to support Azure, then you can go ahead and use Spring Cloud Azure Cloud. For AWS, you can use Spring Cloud for AWS. For Alibaba, okay, and for API gateway, you can go ahead and use Spring Cloud Gateway, okay, and for Netflix and for streaming, you can use Spring Cloud Stream, okay. It provides abstraction layer. You can use implementations like Kafka or Spark. All right, so basically Spring Cloud provides all these portfolio projects or tools for developers to quickly build some of the common patterns in a microservice architecture. All right, so I strongly suggest you to go through these Spring Cloud documentation and these modules to understand in depth about Spring Cloud portfolio projects. Okay, so you can go ahead and use this link as a starting point for your microservices learning. Okay, so go to the spring.io/microservices. So this will guide you how you can use Spring Boot and Spring Cloud to develop the microservices. All right, and you can go ahead and refer this architecture over here. We develop the services using Spring Boot, and each service have their own databases, so that we can deploy each this Spring Boot service in a different container in a Docker. All right, and these are the different services like API gateway, config server, service registry, Spring Cloud, Slate. So these are the few Spring Cloud provided services for managing the complete microservices. Okay, and API gateway is basically it will manage all the requests which comes from different clients, and then it will propagate that request to different services. Okay, client don't have to directly communicate with the services, microservices. It have to first communicate with the API gateway, and then API gateway will propagate that request to the appropriate microservice. All right, so you can go ahead and check out this page. It contains all the information to develop the microservices using Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. All right, so next, MQ. Well, sometimes you need a message queue. For example, let's say if you want to develop a event driven microservice architecture or message driven microservice architecture, then you need to learn message queues. And here these are the two popular message queue brokers, Kafka and RabbitMQ. All right, so basically you need to understand like how one microservice communicate with the other microservice. Okay, so most of the time we use a REST client. Okay, basically we use different protocols like HTTP or MQ. Okay, in case of HTTP, we basically create a REST API client and we make a REST API from one service to other service. And in case of message queue, we basically use publish and subscribe pattern by using RabbitMQ, for example. Okay, one service publish the events or messages, and other services basically subscribe and get the events. All right, if you want to use message queue in your microservice architecture, then you can go ahead and check out Kafka and RabbitMQ. So these are the two popular message queues. Well, apart from Spring Cloud and message queues, you need to know about the design patterns that are required to develop the microservices architecture. Well, there are a lot of well-known design patterns available to develop the microservices architecture. For example, aggregator pattern, CQRS pattern, saga pattern, event sourcing pattern. Okay, so these are the well-known microservices pattern that we can use to develop the microservices architecture. Okay, so just have a basic understanding about the different microservices patterns, so that it will help you to develop the microservices architecture. Okay, great. Well, once you build a microservices project, then you need to deploy in a cloud, right? That is where the DevOps comes into picture. Okay, and just go ahead and learn Docker and Kubernetes. Well, basically in order to deploy your microservice project in cloud, you need to configure or you need to write a lot of files using Docker and Kubernetes in your Spring Boot applications. Okay, so you just need to get an idea like how you can configure Docker and Kubernetes in your Spring Boot application, so that you can able to deploy all the microservices in a cloud. All right, so go ahead and learn like how you can create the Docker containers and how you can configure those containers in your Spring Boot application, and how you can use the Kubernetes to manage the Docker containers and scale the different microservices. Okay, And yeah, so once you have a deployment setup in place, then you can go ahead and deploy in a cloud. Okay, so here you can see different options like AWS, Google Cloud and Azure. So these are the well-known cloud service provider. You can use one of them to deploy your microservices project. All right, great. Well, these are the few things that you need to know in order to develop the microservices project. Okay, first you need to know about Spring Boot and how to develop the REST APIs using Spring Boot, because in microservices project we basically develop the REST API applications as a microservice. Okay, and you need to know how the microservices will get communicate with each other. Okay, by using either HTTP protocol like REST API client or the message queue. Okay, next you need to know about Spring Cloud important portfolio projects. And next you need to know about Docker and Kubernetes, how to configure Docker and Kubernetes in Spring Boot application so that it can be deployed in a cloud. And you need to also know about microservices patterns, for example aggregator, Saga, CQRS, okay, event sourcing. So these are the important microservice patterns that you should know in order to develop the microservices architecture. All right guys, so these are the few things that you can take a look into it in order to learn about developing the microservices projects. So let me know in a comment section if I miss anything in this roadmap. I tried my level best to keep all the high level things. Well, if you want to learn how to build the real-time REST APIs using Spring Boot and how to test your Spring Boot application, then I highly suggest you guys to check out my Udemy courses. For example, you can see here I have published 2 popular courses, that is building real-time REST APIs with Spring Boot and testing Spring Boot application with JUnit and Marketer. Alright, you can go ahead and check out these my Udemy courses, and I'm sure that you will learn how to build the REST APIs using Spring Boot and how to test the Spring Boot application using JUnit and Marketer. I will be publishing more courses on Udemy, so just check out these courses as of now. Alright, so this is the high level roadmap to learn Spring Boot and microservices. If I miss anything in this roadmap, let me know in a comment section so that everybody can refer it. Alright, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching. I will see you in next video.